Hello, I'm Chad Saley with Comp Health, and I'm pleased to be sitting down again with Dr. Andrew Wilner, the author of the book The Locum's Life and the host of the new podcast, The Art of Medicine. You can find it everywhere that podcasts are. Dr. Wilner, welcome. It's good to be with you again.
Thanks, Chad. Glad to be here.
Dr. Wilner also regularly writes for the Comp Health blog, and today we're talking about another one of his posts. About the importance of keeping your medical license even when you're thinking about retirement. So let's just maybe get into the nitty-gritty a little bit of medical licenses and what goes into kind of getting a license, much less renewing it, or what, heaven forbid you have to do if you've let a license lapse. What is that process kind of like?
Yeah, Chad, I think it's a really important topic, and it's not one that people talk about. And it does come up, particularly in let's call them the pre-retirement years for physicians. If you're 60, 65, maybe you don't want to retire, maybe you do. You're not really sure what to do with the license because you do have to pay an annual renewal fee. You do have to keep your CME credits up. Those aren't major requirements, but it's like, well, if I'm not using it, but then the question comes up, so what if I go back into practice? Then I'll need my license. So what I've learned, first of all, in the United States, you need a license to practice in each state that you practice. So if you want to practice in New York, you need a New York license. You want to practice in Rhode Island, you need a Rhode Island license. There is no license that encompasses the country. So you might, and I've had as many as 10 licenses at one time because of my locums work all over the country. And in locums, when a job comes up, say there's this great job in Wisconsin, you say, okay, I'll go get a Wisconsin license. Well, that doesn't really work usually. Because the time it takes to get the license, by that time, the job's over. It's either over and done with or somebody else has snagged it. So if you really want that job, you got to have that license ready in your pocket. And that's why I had so many of them. But getting a license is tedious. The amount of application, the process is just unbelievable. It can go all the way back to medical school, even college, documents, notarized, fingerprints. It's huge. It's expensive. My most recent job, it took 7 months from the day I applied. And I'm not a slacker. So as soon as they asked me for information, I sent it. I wasn't the weak link in that chain. And I remember once I got a letter, your application is complete. It's like, great, I'll hear in a few weeks. A month later, I got a letter, your application is not complete. If we don't receive the remaining information in the next 2 weeks, your application will be, I forget what word they used, but it was basically destroyed. In other words, and you will have to start the process again. It's like, well, what happened to it being complete? Now it's not complete. It is a very difficult process. And the state boards that grant you the license are very, very concerned. I think, you've heard of voter fraud and how often that is, which is not that often. Well, doctor fraud, they're very concerned about that, which also doesn't happen that often. But to talk to them, you'd think it was a daily occurrence. So everything has to be checked and double checked, and it takes them forever. And there's no way to push them. They're not responsible to you. They have no requirement to give you a license. You would think, I'm a perfectly qualified physician. I want my license. The state board does not have to give you one. It is totally up to them, even if you are fully required. It is a privilege to have a license. And you can be disqualified on any number of things, including attitude, or what they would call unprofessional behavior, whatever that is. So you have to be very nice to the people on the other end of the phone, the agencies. Okay, so here you are, you're 65. What should I do with my license? The problem with, there used to be, and some states have it, you can kind of put your license on hold. My license, I think in Nevada, is inactive status. So I pay a little less and I can't use it until I reactivate it. But most states don't have that. So you either have an active license or you don't. And the problem with letting it go is getting a new one, you start from square one. You can't just say, look, I was a licensed physician, in Rhode Island for 20 years. I let it lapse, but I'm bored in retirement. It's 2 years later. I want to go back. You start again as if nothing had ever been done. They never heard of you. Back to your, college transcripts. And this happened to me. I had several licenses, and I had recently moved. And Massachusetts, you have to renew your license on your birthday, I've since learned. So I was actually traveling. I was giving a lecture in another state, and somebody was actually checking my credentials, and they came up to me and said, Dr. Wilner, your Massachusetts license expired 2 days ago. I said, oh, I didn't know that. So as soon as I got home, next day, I called up the board, which took about an hour actually on hold to get someone. And I explained the situation. I said, well, whatever the renewal fee is, I'll FedEx you a check. I'm sorry this happened, but I never got your letter. And I said, you never called me. You never sent me an email. They said, oh no, we're too busy for that. We just send letters. And I said, well, I never got it. And they said, oh yeah, we know you never got it because it came back. It was returned to us. I said, so I didn't get it, and you made no other effort to get in touch with me. They said, that's right, we're too busy. So I said, well, what can we do? They said, oh, you can't do anything. You have to reapply for a license because your license has lapsed. I said, it's only been 3 days. It doesn't matter. You have to start from square one as if you never had a license, get recommendations, transcripts, everything has to be notarized, diplomas, fingerprints. It took me an entire week, 40 hours or more of uncompensated time at my desk, gathering this paperwork, calling people, places you haven't worked 20 years. I haven't worked in North Carolina since I finished my first job many decades ago. They still want a letter from North Carolina saying that my license is in good standing, which I relinquished many years ago, and that they want a letter from them. So you have to call them, and they have to do it. Well, they don't want to do it. Why should they do it? It's one more thing for them to do. So you got to pay them, and then they still don't want to do it. So you're, in the middle of trying to get somebody to do something that they don't want to do. And then the state licensing board, of course, they're very busy. They're in no hurry. And it's a nightmare. So my advice to somebody who's pre-retirement and is not 100% sure that this is the end of their career, just hang on to your license, bite the bullet, pay the $500 or whatever it is every year. Each state is different. Keep up your CME, which is not too hard. It's usually 20 hours a year, which you're going to do anyway if you're still interested in medicine, here and there. And keep your license, because reactivating an old license is usually not possible. You just got to start from square one. And it's a big project, way more than it ought to be. And maybe someday there'll be one federal license like the military has. The VA, you can work in any VA in the country. Doesn't matter as long as you have one state license. Somehow that's not a problem. But each state medical board really has their own turf, and they protect it. And I'll throw in, there's something called the Interstate Medical License. Help me with this, IMLC.
Licensure Compact.
Compact, right. And the idea was to help, physicians sort of be more fluid, moving from state to state. It is greatly misunderstood. It's sort of promoted as a license that allows you to work in many states. It's not. It's just a way to get many licenses a little bit easier, but you still have to get individual state licenses and fulfill their requirements and pay their fees. It does facilitate it a little bit. It's about half of the states in the country that use this system. I will say that, COVID, right? We're in the middle of COVID now. Today's November 9, 2020, has created sort of a problem that people have realized, that preventing physicians from working in the neighboring state, is allowing people to die unnecessarily. Maybe we ought to do something about that. And some of the restrictions, particularly for telemedicine, which requires you to have a state not only where you are, licensed not only where you are, but where the patient is, have been relaxed. Now, whether those requirements will remain relaxed, post-COVID there's been a lot of articles, nobody really knows. We hope so, We hope so. That was kind of, sort of pushed this whole bureaucracy over the cliff. And it got recognized that, this is because, it delays medical care. I've had jobs waiting where I, couldn't take care of patients because the license is still pending and there's nobody there. And it's not good for patients. It's not good for the locums doc. You're waiting with no license. So one solution is you just get a bunch of licenses. So you always have a license ready when a job will pop up. And that's probably the best solution, until we have a unified kind of federal, physician's license that lets you, because people aren't all that different from state to state, from a doctor's point of view.
True, very true. I think that something else that maybe people don't think about is where malpractice insurance kind of comes into play with renewing your license and being able to practice again. Why don't you maybe talk a little bit about kind of what that 2-year clock is on malpractice insurance and how that affects your ability to practice?
Yeah, so this is another lesson that I learned the hard way. The 2 years isn't fixed and is kind of variable, but there's a few rules and regulations at play. So to be clear, let's suppose I'm practicing, everything's great, and I want to sail around the world. It's going to take me about 2.5 years. So I pack up, everything's great, I come back, I want to go back to work. All of a sudden, I can't get a job. And this happened to me. I didn't sail around the world, but I did some other exciting things, and there was a gap. And they said, well, we can't hire you because our hospital has a JCAH requirement that you have to have 2 peer recommendations of your clinical expertise showing your clinical practice within the last 2 years. This is very common. And I said, well, that's going to be tough because I haven't actually practiced. I actually did some volunteer work. They said, oh, that doesn't count. So volunteer work doesn't count. Paid work. And I said, well, this is kind of a catch-22 because nobody can write those recommendations because I haven't worked. And if you're not going to hire me, then I can't get the recommendations. So what am I supposed to do? And it was basically, well, it's tough luck for you. And I lost the position. Similarly, it may happen on the malpractice end where the malpractice carrier may say, oh, well, you haven't worked in 2 years, so, you're rusty. You don't know what you're doing. We're not going to give you insurance. So it can be a hospital credentialing issue, or it could be a malpractice, or it could be both. In my scenario, I had a job, I was accepted, and they found out I hadn't worked in the last 2 years, and they rescinded the offer. And I had to hunt around to the point where I was actually considering early retirement because nobody would hire me. And the irony of that was I actually was a better physician at that point. Even though I had taken time off, I had spent most of that time reading and writing about neurology and going to conferences, and I was probably a whole lot sharper than I was when I left. But, that fell on deaf ears. I eventually found a hospital that frankly was desperate. They'd had 6 neurologists and 5 of them had left for a variety of reasons, each one for a different reason. And they really needed a neurologist. So we set up kind of a supervisory scenario, and I had to go get a letter. I worked 2 weeks under a guy and got him to write me a letter, and then they put me on sort of probation, and then it all worked out. And then after that, never had a problem again. Once you get back in, you get your recommendations, then it's a non-issue. But there are many cases that I've heard of, particularly surgeons, women, right? So say you've got a 33-year-old OBGYN doctor. She wants to have a couple kids. So she has a couple kids. She's out of practice 3 or 4 years, wants to get back in. No way. Can't do it. No surgical experience for 4 years. Nobody's going to trust her. So it's very tough. So anyone who's considering a break from their practice needs to keep that in mind. So what's the solution? 1, don't take time off. 2, if you're going to take time off, figure out how much time you can get away with. Probably a year is the only safe amount of time. It's just about enough to make it around the world, depending on how fast your sailboat is. And the other thing is to work a little bit, to work locum tenens. Had I known all about this, you know, if you work a week here and a week there, it resets the clock, because all you have to do is produce those 2 recommendations and say, oh yeah, I worked here and it was just a few months ago and everything's good. Then you can space it out. So if you're, say, a woman, you want to have a few kids, find a way to work a few weeks a year, you know, and do a good job and keep from getting shut out. This is a problem that no one knows about, but it's real. There's even a program in California, what they call physician retraining program. It's actually designed for physicians who have retired and want to go back into practice. And they can't, because they've been out 2 or 3 years and nobody will hire them because of these, what I think are hyperbolic concerns about, you know, I mean, being a doctor requires a lot of focus, but it's a little bit like riding a bike. I think if you've been an excellent physician for 40 years, you take a couple years back off, you ought to be able to get back into it. It shouldn't be impossible. You know, if you've, you know, forgotten everything you learned, that's a different story. But I think most doctors are sort of lifelong learners. And so I think this problem is highly overrated. But you don't want to be a victim to it. And locum tenens can really bail you out by just doing some locums assignments, you know, here and there during your time off. And there are people that do that. I know there's a couple lives on a sailboat and they sail around, and every now and then they come in and they work in the local ER and then off they go again. And so I think their plan is to do that for, you know, the next few decades. So that's the way to do it.
Yeah, I think you brought up a good point in that just a lot of this is unknown, that physicians just don't realize that this is the kind of the way things are. Locums is obviously a great kind of solution to that. You can still take that time off and, like you say, work a weekend here or there, or a week or 2, you know, find some assignments and reset that clock, and at least gives you those options so that you can keep working as long as you want to work. And then once you're ready to fully retire and do it 100%, you know, then it doesn't matter. But if there's any chance that you want to come back and work again, it's probably a good idea to keep that license. Thanks again.
Oh, can I clarify, Chad? Because
absolutely.
I want to add one other thing, that this is not a license issue. That during this time I had kept my license up, my CMEs. It's not a license issue. If you keep your license up, but that's not enough. I thought that was enough. I got an active license. It's these other players. It's the, you know, the hospital credentialing committee. It's the medical malpractice group. It's not, of course, if you let your license lapse, that's another whole story. You don't want to do that. Then you may never get that. We can talk about that another time. That's another issue. But even if you keep your license up, you can still kind of get stuck with no job option. And, you know, physicians train a long time to be able to do their profession. You don't want some bureaucracy keeping you from helping people. Absolutely. Well, thanks again, Dr. Wilner. It's always great to talk with you, and I appreciate your insight. Yeah, it was my pleasure, Chad. Thanks for having me.